So this is just a few slides just to kind of give you an idea what it is we do in macro, how we do it. Okay, right. Off we go. Okay, here we are. Okay, so this talk looks at the approach that we take to teaching macroeconomics to postgraduate students here in Sheffield. So in the days of sort of competing schools of thought in macroeconomics are pretty much over. There's no longer sort of debate between sort of Keynesians and monetarists and all that sort of ghastly old stuff that you might have heard of before. So what I try to do is I try to introduce students to one overarching framework upon which to build, which will incorporate different sort of ways of doing macroeconomics. So to give you an example, the very simplest real business cycle model is just a special case of a far more complex so-called new Keynesian model that would be used by sort of central banks and national treasuries for forecasting purposes. So beneath apparent differences in these models does, however, lie a common framework. And if we spend some time in this course getting the basics right, what we then do is we try to equip the students with the tools with which to build basically any kind of macro models and proceed towards independent research. Right, so to give you an understanding of how the macroeconomy works and how do we model it? How do you sort of start building something? Because as economists, if you do a degree in economics, someone's going to tell you, well, can you explain this to me? So which framework would you use? So let me just sort of carry on. This slide is called the surprisingly simple baseline model of modern macroeconomics. And if you think of modern macroeconomics, so for a lot of you, you will take a course in macro and you will take a course in microeconomics. And modern macroeconomics is micro-based. So this isn't some sort of, oh, I don't like microeconomics, I'm going to do macro. Macro is based on microeconomics. So you need to understand microeconomics to understand macroeconomics. So microeconomics looks at the behavior of households and firms. And in macroeconomics, we take the behavior of households and firms, and we aggregate across all of them to say it's something about how the macroeconomy as a whole works. Because if you think of what is consumption, consumption is just made up of the choices, the choices that a household does. It's the sum of all households. So in the basic macro model nowadays, we have three basic ingredients. The first ingredient are the preferences of a so-called representative household. And this equation here if you've never seen this before, this might look reasonably horrifying, but it doesn't really. This just is this is a function utility. It just means what makes you happy: consumption and leisure. Yeah, lying at the beach, drinking a good beer, that makes you happy, right? To lie on the beach, you need leisure. Sorry. And here's the consumption: it's in the hotel, it's the beer, it's the restaurant meal, it's whatever you're enjoying. And this is not just this is utility here, and then this bit here, this just simply says it's the expected sum of all utility from today onwards, right? And that's what you maximize. So in every single period, you try to maximize your utility. And we define utility as a function of consumption and leisure, or consumption, or the disutility of labor. N actually here stands for labor. Because labor is a disutility. Labor is not nice. The reason you get paid for work is because work isn't that nice. With our production technology, the production technology is simply a production function, and this is a technology that sort of explains how do we produce output. Well, we produce output using capital, and we produce output using labor, and we use output using A, which is technology. So it's three basic components of this. And then finally, in economics, you will always see you maximize, you have an indifference curve or an isoquant, and you maximize this subject to a constraint. And this constraint here is called the resource constraint. And the resource constraint basically governs how you accumulate capital. So this states that the capital stock tomorrow is equal to the capital stock today, or rather the proportion of the capital stock that has not yet depreciated today, plus the difference between output and consumption, so savings. Savings equal to investment. So capital stock today is equal to investment today, plus the capital stock you still have that hasn't depreciated this period. So all we do is we maximize utility here, subject to these two constraints, the technology constraint and the resource constraint. That's it, done. That's macroeconomics for you. That simple, essentially. Yeah. So once we start with a really simple one, once we master how to do this sort of framework, then we can build upon that. So the above model that I've just shown you, those three equations, that goes by the nice name of the real business cycle model, so the RBC model. So we use this model to understand how fluctuations in productivity can cause business cycles. So what causes a boom, what causes a bust? Yeah. So if you think of A as in the production function as a factor that accounts for exogenous moment in the productivity of factors, yeah, then shifts to A that are exogenous, kind of model like this, like some sort of autoregressive process, can then explain movements, business cycles, can then come about because you've got random shocks here in this term there. This is like a white noise shock. So you get small fluctuations in this, and that causes then large fluctuations in output over time. That's what we do in order to explain booms and busts. And why do we do this? Because booms and busts are essentially not very predictable, right? If economists could predict when the next recession is going to be, we would all be so wealthy that we wouldn't have to give talks like this or teach or do anything else. We could just predict the economy. Because there's this random element, that's why we are able to model it simply as a random shock that is not forecastable. Okay, that's the basic model. So fluctuations in total factor productivity as a driver of the business cycle are to some extent a feature of developed economies. So in emerging markets, what tends to drive the business cycle are fluctuations in the trend, right? So whereas TFP in the RBC model, A, should be thought as fluctuations of productivity around a constant trend, it is straightforward to adopt the basic framework to account for fluctuations in the trend. So here, output fluctuates around the trend. But in lots of developing countries, the trend itself is what is fluctuating. And so, again, the basic framework allows us to quite simply, just look at this thing A with a squiggle on top, and this A and a squiggle on top then just sort of allows us to say that output, consumption, and capital now all grow at the same rate. And this is this rate G, where what we then shock is this growth rate G. Yeah. So again, we have a simple model, which we've done quite a modest expansion to it, and are now able to analyze trends. Right. So if we do extend this a little bit more. So let me introduce two useful extensions in our baseline model: government spending and investment-specific technology. So what do we have to do to the utility function? Nothing. Production technology, also nothing. Now comes capital accumulation. Here before we had y minus c. Let me just relabel y minus c as investment x. Okay. So now what we can do, if we multiply x by this q business here, a sort of q. Think of q as a price, right? A price of investment goods. And Q, or is some sort of another productivity term, which affects the efficiency with which investment or savings are transformed into new capital stock. That's actually quite important. If you think of shocks, well, I'll get to that in a couple of bullet points time. And if you want to introduce government spending, well, how do we introduce government spending? Well, we have our capital accumulation constraint of just what we saw before, this thing here. If this bit's investment, then we can simply rewrite this as here. National income identity, outputs equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending. Yeah. So that's how you add government spending to the model. So what do we get from this? Well, first of all, we can analyze the effects of government spending to allow us to understand the effects of government spending on the business cycle. What does an increase in G actually do in this model? What about Q? What about this investment-specific technology shock that we introduced? So think of a recent episode where the flow of savings from households to firms via banks was impeded. Yeah. So if you understanding investment-specific technology shocks is a first pass at understanding something like a financial crisis. Yeah. Arguably, what this kind of model doesn't do that brilliant a job is try to explain something like a pandemic that we just are living through at the moment. What about money? Now, so far, this is a real model. It doesn't have any money. So in our course, what we do is we introduce money into this, our basic framework, in a very simple way. Why do we have money? What does money do? Well, money has a useful feature in that we need it to buy consumption goods, right? And this is the so-called cash in advance model. And I always have to remind students that money is not just sort of, notes and coin in circulation. I very rarely these days use actual, notes of money. I do most of my payments simply nowadays with a mobile phone, not even with a debit card, right? But still, you have to have the money sort of in your current account. So that's the kind of definition of money. And you need money in your current account in order to purchase goods. And if you do this, well, then all we do is we take our, again, we amend our constraint. And our constraint, the household's constraint, then simply says that we have this thing M here that we accumulate. Yeah. So our sources of income plus money that's carried over from last period that we're able to spend. And then we've got something here called the cash in advance constraint, which simply says that the money balances we hold today have to be as equal to consumption. So why does this matter? What does this do? What we have down here is an optimality condition. And in the RBC model that I showed you before, this term here, this optimality condition, which is the margin utility of margin utility of labor divided by the margin utility of consumption, this would simply be equal to the real wage, the marginal product of labor. Yeah, this gives you the optimality condition in a model without money or without the cash in advance constraint. And so when you introduce a cash in advance constraint, we get this extra term here, which seems to be a function of the nominal interest rate. And if you look at this blob here, this is a wedge. This cash in advance constraint introduces a wedge into the optimality condition for consumption of labor. And this, as I said, this wedge consists of the nominal interest rate. So why is this interesting? Why does this matter? It matters because it offers us a first pass at what an optimal monetary policy strategy would look like, right? Because here, what would be the optimal, if you think about the optimality condition would be, this is an optimal way for an economy to work if the margin, if this thing here is called the marginal rate of substitution, if that's equal to the relative price. But this relative price here gets distorted by having a positive nominal interest rate. So it turns out in this model, the optimal interest rate is 0. So this brings us towards something called an optimal monetary policy. So we've talked about the effects of fiscal policy, we've talked about the effects of a very simple way of modeling monetary policy. And we've done all this in 9 minutes. Macro and finance. If the global financial crisis taught us anything, it is that finance and macro belong in the same analysis. So a simple way of analyzing, a simple way of introducing, a simple way we can do this is to treat, goodness me, a simple way we can introduce this is to treat entrepreneurs as credit constraint agents. Yes. So if you think of an entrepreneur receives utility, and an entrepreneur has a constraint. Yeah. This is the budget constraint of the entrepreneur. D would be he can borrow. Yeah. This is his income, which is the return from renting capital, etc. He accumulates capital just like the firm did in the RBC model. But now, because this is an entrepreneur and he's impatient for some reason, we can introduce a credit constraint. And by introducing this credit constraint, we can have here, we have this variable Q, so the price of installed capital, the price of equity. So changes in the price of equity affect the amount the entrepreneur can borrow to invest. So what happened in the financial crisis? We have what happens in any market economy when there's a sort of when there's a fall in share prices. If there's a fall in share prices, well, what happens then is it would affect Q here, QT plus 1. And the fall in share prices affects the entrepreneur's ability to borrow in order to invest, right? Because you've got finance and you've got macro. And so in finance, you learn why, what causes, how to price an option, how to price shares or whatever. So what we have here is a model where a fall in the share price has a direct effect on the macroeconomy. Yeah. Okay, this is start simple and then expand. This is a simple framework that allows us the research to add more complexity where and when it's needed. There's another course in the department where we teach students how to numerically solve these models, which by the way is not as easy as it looks, and to explore further modification to the basic model. Are you interested in the model of inflation dynamics? Well, just add nominal rigidities and monopolistic competition. Interested in unemployment? Just add search and matching frictions in the labor market. Why do we do macro like this? What's the point of this? Because what we do at the University of Sheffield, this is very much research-led teaching. Yeah, it's not just a buzzword. It's actually more fun, right? So all these model extensions that I've talked to you about are taken from my own research. Right? So I like to teach students to sort of, do the kind of economics that I've done. Let me just sort of give you an example. These are sort of, 4 papers that I've highlighted here. There's the first one. It's called Financial Shocks in the US Business Cycle. So what I do here, I use a sticky price model, business model with financial frictions to gauge the importance of financial shocks in the business cycle. And it turned out that they're far more important than we previously thought. The other paper called News-Driven Business Cycles in an Open Economy that I published in 2017. This is another look at sort of a business cycle model with financial frictions. What we do there, we look at so-called news shocks. Yeah. So news shocks, instead of having productivity, and productivity hits now, you expect productivity to increase in the future. Yeah. So if you think about it, what kind of car are you expecting to be driving in 10 years from now? If you ask me what kind of car am I expecting to drive today, well, today I'm going to drive the car that's parked outside my office, my window at the moment, and that's an old diesel car. Yeah. If you ask me what car will I be driving in 10 years' time, I expect to be driving probably an electric car, probably with a technology that does not yet exist. But I know the technology is out there, or that it will exist in 10 years from now. So this is kind of, how do we react to news, to events, to shocks that happen in the future? Yeah. Then another paper I did called Commodity Prices and Labor Market Dynamics in Small Open Economies, published in 2018, is where we look at sort of what happens if you're a small commodity producer, and basically the price of your commodity rises. What effects does that have on your labor market? So does an increase in the price of, how does an increase in the price of oil if you're Canada affect Canadian unemployment? Yeah. And then another paper using a sort of similar framework looked at skilled migration and business cycle dynamics. Yeah. So what happens in the sort of RBC type model when there is a shock to the flow of migrants coming in or coming out of the country? Yeah, what are the dynamics implied by this? Because if you think of migration, migration is a sort of labor market, is a sort of labor supply shock. How does that affect the economy? So that kind of, with this slide, what I'm trying to tell you is that the sort of teaching that we do is, for most of us, is very much informed by the kind of research that we do, right? Our teaching allows us to talk about our research to the next generation of young researchers. And that's why we do these things.